The Elefant was one of the most intimidating tanks of World War II, but right now, this is nothing more than plastic. Today, I'm going to turn the 48 scale tamiya Elefant into a battle-hardened tank destroyer. The only question is, how far can I push the weathering before I ruin it? Let's find out. Most Elephants had Zimmerit, but after surfing Google, I came across a lot of pictures of the Elefant in Italy in 1944 with no Zimmerit, so that is the vehicles I will be trying to replicate. First step was to assemble the gun mount, and since the gun mount was made of cast metal, I opted to use tamiya extra thin cement and a toothbrush in the stippling motion to achieve the texture, and then after it dried, I added tamiya extra thin cement mixed with the tamiya putty to show more depth to the cast texture on the gun mount. If you love what you're seeing on my channel and you want to see more, go to our Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok page where we post more weekly updates. But the final reveal of all models that are built will always be on here on YouTube, so don't forget to hit that subscribe button. After construction of the gun mount was completed, the instructions called out for a small piece to lock the gun mount in place. Now this thing slid right into place, it snapped in nice and tight. And the best part, there's no glue required, and it kept the mount completely movable. I'll admit, after the gun mount was assembled and ready to install, and I started gluing the superstructure together, I realized too late I forgot to attach a piece to help support the gun mount when gluing the superstructure together. But being careful, I was still able to complete the step, and after this, I'll definitely have to pay more close attention to the instructions so I don't do this twice. There is only one of these 65-ton beasts still in existence today, and it's at the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in Aberdeen, Maryland, for all to enjoy and to keep history alive. Designer Ferdinand Porsche was so sure he'd win the Tiger tank contract that he made 90 chassis in advance, and when Henschel won the contract, he recycled those chassis into the Elefant, which was originally named the Ferdinand. Once the hull was together, the suspension was on, road wheels were together, it was track time. And for this, I chose to use aftermarket tracks from T-Rex Studio, 48 scale 3D printed tracks for this beast. And let me tell you, this was my first time using a 3D printed part that I absolutely will be using T-Rex Studio products definitely in my next video and builds. Now, I could have used the length tracks that Tamiya provides, but once I get to the weathering stage, you'll see why I opted for the aftermarket products. There is literally no cleanup with these tracks. They give you an inner and an outer pin that easily slide into place with just a small amount of pressure. You don't want too much pressure. They are 3D printed. They do snap very easy. And these tracks are fully workable. And since this is my first time using T-Rex tracks to build a full 2 sets of tracks, they give such a beautiful finish and natural sag to this beautiful kit. And I cannot stop saying enough good things about T-Rex Studio tracks. And I'll definitely be using these tracks in future builds because I have had the best outcome with these tracks. I have used model casting tracks and Bronco and other aftermarket accessory tracks in the past, and I have not had the outcome like I did with the T-Rex Studio tracks. And like I said, I can't stop saying enough good things about these tracks. I do think if you guys can, if anyone watching wants to try them, I definitely suggest trying them. They do design the tracks for the Tacom kits, and they're amazing. Since this kit does come with metal weights, you don't have to worry about the road wheels not having constant contact with the tracks. After assembly, I gave this beast a coat of flat white primer, my absolute favorite. Next, I fired up my airbrush and started to pre-shade. I usually only use Tamiya paints to paint my kits because it's the easiest paint for me to get, but on my next video, I will be using AK Interactive's Real Color to paint my vehicle for the first time. For my thinner, I use Mr. Color Leveling Thinner 400 as I find it gives me the best results. I will use Tamiya X28 thinner when I apply my clear coat, top coats, or varnish to protect my painted surfaces. Doing it this way, I have found that I don't get any orange peel or any unwanted textures on the painted surfaces. For my pre-shade color, I used olive drab mixed with a small amount of reddish brown. If you are going to pre-shade with the crown of your airbrush off, be sure you do not get too close to the kit or you will bend your needle. Then it was time to add the base coat. My version of dark yellow starts with light brown and I add small drops of dark yellow till I get the consistency and the color I'm looking for. When I go to airbrush it on my vehicle, I do it in thin layers so I can build up the effect of the paint and still be able to see the pre-shading beneath the base coat. Remember, when using light coats to build up the effect, to be able to see, in this case, the pre-shading come through the base coat, less is always more. This way you can still see the effect of your pre-shading, and the pre-shading does not completely vanish, and you have to start over. For my camo, I chose to mix my own colors with Hull Red, Flat Brown, and a drop or two of my base color. Where I wanted the camo to sit, I first started with the thin lines first. Once I was sure I liked the placement of the piece of camo, I went back and I made those lines thicker to scale. The only reason I did this was if I did not like the placement where I put the camo, it was only a small area where I would have to reapply the base coat and start over. My choice of camouflage pattern came from a few different places, mainly the images I was able to find online of the Elefant back in 1944, as well as the paint call-out sheet that came with the Tamiya kit, and then a little bit of my own rendition to those patterns just to make this piece stand out on its own and just look amazing. For me, I always practice my camouflage patterns on the underside of my hull where it won't be seen, covered in mud. This way, if I make a mistake, I can easily correct it. The last camo color to be applied is my dark green. For this, I started with a dark green base. I mixed in small amounts of the red brown that I used for the last part of the camouflage, and I added drops of my base coat to give it more of a warmer hue to the darker color. Doing this to me makes it look like the camo colors belong together and they aren't as stark. After the camouflage was applied, I gave an overall thin coat of Tamiya flat clear to seal in the paint before I added the decals. When I start doing my decals, I always start with taking my hobby blade and poking small holes into the decal. This allows it to sit so much easier on the textured surfaces with micro set and micro sol to help, and it conforms a lot easier to the surfaces with the small little holes from the hobby blade in them. After I applied my decals, I gave it another thin coat of flat clear, and then my favorite part started, the weathering. I always apply an overall filter first to my kits, and in this case I use Tamiya Clear Yellow thinned with X28 thinner. In future builds, I am going to start to use Tamiya's other clear paints to see if I can get just as good results with them as I do with the yellow. For the superficial surface scratches, I used my dark yellow base coat mixed with a lot of buff to get the lighter version of my base coat. After I loaded up my sponge, I started chipping away, moving and turning the sponge to get none that looked the same. I didn't want any similarities between my chips, so I kept moving my sponge in multiple different directions. For the more heavily worn areas, I used an 18-0 brush to make that area a little bit more worn and tried to keep it in the foot traffic direction from the crew getting on or off of the vehicle. I used the same sponge and 18-0 brush to apply the Hull red chips, showing the chips that went right down to the original primer color of the Elefant. Now, being as this is a 48 scale kit, I had not had as much experience on this scale, so I did not want to try to paint the chips on. For any and all chips on the side of the casemate, or even just the side of the fenders, I used still the sponge, but I also used a toothpick to try to help replicate the scratches from trees, bushes, buildings as it would drive by, be scratched up or drive through them. And I felt the toothpick would be the best option to try to replicate those scratches higher up on the casemate. When using a toothpick to replicate scratches, I visualized the direction of travel that the vehicle would be driving in and just tried to keep them more to scale and not big, gaudy spots. Next, I move on to the pin wash. Since I prefer to make my own washes, I use Winsor & Newton's Raw Umber and AK Interactive's Odorless Thinner. Now, I could use a pre-made wash, but I have found with the ones I have, when I remix the washes prior to use, the oil doesn't completely break up the way it's supposed to, leaving more of a grainy looking texture, and I really did not want that to be on my washes, so I opted to make my own. Now, when I do my pin washes, I only do one side of the vehicle at a time, and I mainly focus on a smaller section of that side so I can get better saturation with the oil filter, allowing it a good few minutes to dry before I even start to think about blending in or removing the oil from the unwanted spots or areas on the vehicle. But one thing to keep in mind if you're going to make your own pin washes and filters with oil paints is to consistently be stirring your mix. If you don't, and I've done this a bunch of times before, the oil and thinner will separate and you'll just be left with colored thinner that has no oil in it. If you missed my last build, I built the Border Models M4A1 mid-production Sherman. I'll leave a card here at the top of the screen and on the end screen of this video, so you can go and enjoy my process of building and weathering the M4A1 Sherman. If you're enjoying this video and want to help the channel out, hit that subscribe button, leave a like, and share this video with a modeler in your life. Once the pin wash was allowed to completely dry, I used a brush just dampened with odorless thinner, and to clean off the oil left after the pin wash was dried, I simply move around some of the oil still because it's still able to be played with a bit, to just push it into the crevices of where I want it, around like bolt heads, pistol ports. And if after it's dried and I really don't like the placement, then all I do is just load up my brush with all the thinner I need and I wipe it right off the vehicle and start over. Down in the comments below, what's your favorite part of this amazing hobby? Is it the building, the painting, the weathering, or just buying the kits? I'll leave my answer in the comments below for it. Once I was done the pin wash, I allowed the vehicle to dry for a couple of days, so this way the oils would settle. And on my dot filter, when I went to blend it, I would not pull out the color that I had previously put on for my pin wash. For my dot filter, I used oils from Winsor and Newton, and for those, the colors were titanium white, burnt sienna for more of a reddish color, yellow green, and 502 of Thailand's faded green. To achieve the effect I was after, I kept the dot filter closer to the middle of each side and away from the edges to give it that dark and light contrast. Going dark to light on each side, to do this, I applied the dots in more of a random pattern, but I did put the burnt sienna closer to the red brown camouflage, as well as the faded green to the dark green camouflage. And to simply blend it, I used a brush dampened with odorless thinner and just started to blend it, pulling it in a streaky motion up and down, being mindful to keep it closer to the middle and away from the hard edge. If you do happen to get the oil on the edges where you don't want it, so you can still keep that dark to light contrast, it is super easy to wipe off with just the odorless enamel thinner. That's the beauty of working with oils. Nothing is permanent if you don't give it time to dry. So these oils are still very much workable for 48 to 72 hours, given you don't add more thinner or oil to it. They will dry to a very flat finish. 502 of Thailand oils are fantastic, but for value perspective, go with Winsor & Newton's. You can get them at all craft stores, and they're a larger container, better value for your dollar. When my focus turned to the top of the casemate and the engine deck, I applied the dot filter in the same random fashion that I did on the sides. I chose to do a stippling method to blend and diffuse the oils into the surface, achieving the same effect I had achieved on the side of the casement. I chose the stippling method to blend and diffuse the oils on the flat surfaces because with the commander's cupola and hatches protruding from the surface, I did not want to use the streaking method and get a excess buildup around those protrusions, making it more work to try to diffuse them and get them away from around those protrusions. Learning how to stipple and streak your oil paints are some of the most time-consuming techniques that a new beginner will ever experience. And it has taken me 2 decades to get to the point where I can stipple and streak my vehicles, and I'm very, very happy with the results. And practice makes perfect on the stippling and streaking technique. I definitely would recommend any new beginners watching this video to just practice. And that's why the underside of the hull is never seen, and it's a perfect area and opportunity to learn. Next, I added a few rust streaks, mixing the same oils I used for the dot filter to get a nice reddish brown. This time I only applied a couple dots to both sides, and with a completely dry brush to pull the oil down, only leaving a small, subtle rust streak. After letting the oils dry for a couple days, I used AK Interactive Rain Marks to give the dusty rain appearance to the vehicle. Yes, I know I said I mixed my own filters and washes, but this is the only one I have that actually mixes properly with no issue. For the rain marks, I used a streaking method on all vertical surfaces, keeping the starting point of the rain marks to the top edge of the structure, and on the engine deck and on the top of the casemate, I used the stippling method to diffuse it to give it the exact same appearance with two different methods of application. In videos to come, I will demonstrate on how to do rain marks using dish soap, tap water, and tamiya paint. Out of all products, we're going to use tamiya paint to create rain marks. When I use pigments, I like to work in threes with a light color, dark color, and a middle shade color. In this case, I use European Earth, Yellow Ochre, and Light Sienna. Only mixing it a little so you can see the variation of the three colors. But this time, the color of the pigment is not going to matter. And I'll show you why in a little bit. But before that, I apply the pigment as I usually would and used X20A thinner from Tamiya as my fixer. After I applied my fixer, I used more pigment dusted on top to try to create more of the clumpy mud appearance that will aid in my weathering in the next step. Once the pigment had dried and I blew away all the loose pigment from the surface, I fired up my airbrush and loaded it with thinner and Tamiya flat earth. I used the clump pigment as a base so I could alter the color with flat earth to show more of a realistic mud buildup on the hull that would actually be approved upon with the next step of my weathering process. This is the first time I've ever painted on top of my pigment, and it just shows you that no matter how long you've been in this hobby, you can always learn something new. For me, I wanted to see if I could alter the color of the pigment with the paint and have it stick properly, and it did. So I'll definitely be using this technique in upcoming builds, and maybe instead of using pigment, I'll be using plaster of Paris to create the base for the mud, or even AK Interactive diorama products like the wet mud, the cracking sand, stuff like that, because you can always keep learning. One of my last steps, not the final step, one of them, for my lower hull, I wanted to add fresh mud. And to achieve this, I used the same three pigments that I had already previously put on: the European Earth, Yellow Ochre, and Light Sienna. This time though, I mixed a dark brown wash and Ammo's wet effects to it, thinned down with AK's odorless enamel thinner. I applied this in a thinner layer to allow the effect to build up. Doing that, it gave me maximum control on the process. This way, if it got on areas that I did not want it to be, it was easily wiped off and didn't have any time to dry. And I will say this effect really did make the lower hull pop, and really a very easy step that I've never tried again. And I definitely will be doing it in future builds using just the products that I have already to make the kits look completely different than what I've ever done. The last thing I wanted to add to the vehicle before the tracks and the road wheels was splashes to the lower hull and the sides of the casemate and the top of the engine deck. For this, I used Ammo's Dust and Dusty Earth oils, thinned down slightly with odorless thinner just to make it a little bit more workable for this purpose. After I loaded my brush with the oils, I did unload some of it on a paper towel just to offload what the excess, so this way it didn't happen to drip or get on to the vehicle in a big ugly blotch. For this, I just let them go randomly where it naturally would occur, and if I didn't like where the splash landed and I thought it looked too weird or unrealistic, I just wiped it away with odorless thinner. And on some of the splashes, I pulled them down in a streaky motion, allowing gravity just to take its natural course. And I think they actually turned out very well, and yeah, more weathering coming. Now the tracks are painted dark iron base and misted with reddish brown to give that subtle appearance of rust. To start the rest of the weathering process, I generously applied the same pigments fixed with X28 thinner as a solid base to improve upon in the following weathering steps to make this kit have a beautiful, beautiful pair of tracks and that fit this beast perfectly. Once the pigment was dry on the tracks, I used a dark brown wash to apply only to the direct centers of each track link. Alter the color to give it the appearance that it was a little bit more fresh than the rest of the cleat. And this step is definitely built upon in the following steps to come. Flat earth was used to just give each run of tracks just a little dust coat, just to match what the lower hull had received, to marry the tracks, road wheels, and the lower hull together, making it all look proper and make it look like it belongs. Next, it was time to mix up more fresh mud. Again, I used the same three pigments: European earth, yellow ochre, and light sienna, mixed with dark brown wash and ammo wet effects. This time it was thinned down a lot. I simply applied it to each track link in a very random fashion, not covering the entire link, allowing it to flow into the nooks and crannies in a very natural way. Now, I did both runs and allowed them to dry for a couple hours. If you really want to speed up the process and just do the tracks as quick as you can use a hair dryer and an airbrush with no paint, and this product will dry rapidly quick, and you'll be able to just keep on trucking and get your tracks done. It's very important not to make your tracks look uniform. And for this, I take real world examples. And when I see construction sites or the forklifts at work, I just look at how the tracks rust and how they accumulate mud, dirt, and grime just throughout the day. And I try to replicate that as best as I can on a 48 scale or a 35th scale kit. Just keeping in mind to be random, experiment with your process on how you want to do the links and how you want to see the tracks come out, and you will get the results you're looking for with a little bit of patience and some effort and time. Next, I use the fresh mud on the leading edges on the inside of the tracks to give it the proper appearance. Keeping in mind, I made sure I did not get the fresh mud anywhere where the road wheels would contact the tracks. Let me know down in the comments below. Do you guys like one complete build and weather video, or do you like two-part videos? Because my next project is the Panther G Late using T-Rex Studio tracks and accessories. And I want to know, do you guys want me to do a part 1 and a part 2, or do you want to do a build and weather video all in one? After the fresh mud had dried, I used an old toothbrush, not new, on the outside of the tracks just to knock back some of the fresh mud, leaving, in my opinion, just the right amount of dried mud on this track. Next, I turned my attention to the inside of the track. I used AK Interactive's aluminum real color marker to show the polished metal look from the contact between the metal road wheels and the track. Now, I only used the aluminum as a base so the pigment would adhere better, and I did the same to the road wheels and the drive sprockets. To get the shiny steel look, I used a brush and dark steel pigment on the inside of the tracks. And for the road wheels, I rubbed the pigment on my finger and ran it on the side of the steel surfaces and a little bit on the edge of each road wheel to give it the look that it was freshly polished steel. And then, just like the hull, I used dust and dusty earth as splashes on the tracks, just being mindful to keep the effect a little bit more subtle than on the hull and keeping it away from the polished steel. And to finish the tracks off 100%, I used my finger with the dark steel pigment again and ran my finger on the ends of the track links and the surface of the links to show the dark steel polished look with the tracks. And now that the tracks are done and the road wheels are done, it's time to get them on this beast. But before I show you the finished model, I first have one more step on the process to show you, and then we're about now that this build is coming to an end and everything's starting to come together for this Elefant. This is really starting to look like a real beast, and I can't wait to show you all the finished model. But we got 2 more steps to do. I know I said 1, but it's 2, and this will make it look even better. First, I applied silver to show some fresh scratches on the eyelets of the tow cables. I just kept in mind I wanted to keep it more localized to just the eyelets where the metal on metal would contact, and being very steady-handed, being mindful that the rest of the kit's already painted to apply this. So I used a toothpick and it came out really nice. The spare track is my final component to add to the completed model. First, I used a dark brown wash, hitting all the recessed areas of the track. Once it was dry, then I was able to really start to make these tracks look sweet. To do that, I started with adding some fresh silver to the tie downs and the spare track hooks that were pre-molded on the tracks, and using a toothpick just dabbing away to make it look more realistic. The final weathering step, I added fresh mud mix to the spare tracks, making sure I gave a solid coat to the entire track length. And after it was applied, I used a little bit of just clean thinner to kind of work the way at it and remove some excess. Once it was fully dry, I used an old brush and toothbrush to knock off about 85% of the mud, leaving with what I feel was a really good, nice effect on the spare track. And I do think I'm going to be using this effect again. Next, I added the spare track to the kit, the 2 runs of spare track on the front, the 1 on the rear, and this kit was about to wrap up. Last step, I used 5% buff, 95% thinner, and gave the kit an overall very light dusting of the buff, keeping my airbrush about 6 to 12 inches away. And with that, we are done this beast. Thank you everyone for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Enjoy the playlist right here. I'll see you on the next one. And I will say this is the best kit I have ever built so far. And I plan on making the Panther G Late the next in the line of my best kits I've ever done.